If you're watching this on YouTube and aren't subscribed, make sure to click the subscribe button, like, comment, let us know what you think about the episode. If there's a particular guest or topic that you'd like to hear about, we're always checking your comments on there and love to be able to take your feedback and then get them on to future episodes. Today I'm going to be talking with DFC Diesel and going over 6.4 engines. I've seen a lot of requests from you guys to cover ways to build them, any new advancements. Are they a good engine? Should it be a truck that you buy? So I'm looking forward to going into detail with them about ways they can make the 6.4 Powerstroke more reliable, things to look out for, and is it a good buy in 2024? Before we get to it, I want to give a shout out to one of our sponsors that helps make the Diesel podcast possible. Kershaw Knives has a discount code that gets you up to 40% off MSRP. If you go to kershaw.kaiusa.com and use code 40 TDP 2024, get you up to 40% off MSRP. So it's a great way to save some money, get some cool gear if you're in the market for a new EDC knife, something for hunting, fishing, around the job site. Around the house, they've got you covered with a bunch of different options for blade steel, blade shape, different opening mechanisms, different handle designs, and we really appreciate them offering that discount code just for Diesel Podcast listeners. All right, let's get to today's podcast, talking about 6.4 Powerstrokes with DFC Diesel. Matt, welcome to the Diesel Podcast. How you been?
Yeah, pretty good yourself.
Pretty good. Just getting ready for the holidays, and this whole year's gone by so quick. I can't believe it's going to be 2025 here. In just a couple of weeks. I don't know where the year went, but it went by fast.
I know. Honestly, just the last couple of years in general. I mean, between COVID and it's almost been like better part of 2+ years since even the general end of that and stuff. So it's good to start putting that in our rearview mirror a bit.
Yeah, the last 4 or 5 years just kind of flew by. I saw some comments because I always ask on like before episodes, like if people want to hear about a topic or from a guest or a particular thing to do with a truck to comment. And I've been noticing some more people ask for 6.4 content. And it's been a while since we've talked about them. So I thought it'd be cool to talk about that engine platform in 2024, 2025. I think that truck to me, it always stood out to me because it was about the time I got my first diesel truck. I didn't have a 6.4, and I was so jealous of how much power they could make with just a tune. Yeah. And the transmission seemed to hold up, and they were kind of the envy. Like if you had a Cummins or a Duramax, you were kind of envious that you could make, about 600 horsepower stock transmission. They seemed to last forever. But then it went through, I think just being on the road for a while, they got a really bad rap with failures, the cost of building the engines, people going through 2 or 3 or 4 of them. And I've never owned one, never really been around them. So I thought it'd be cool to chat with you and get your opinion on them from an engine building perspective. Maybe the evolution of it from, the early days till now, some techniques or things that you guys do to help them live, and let's get your overall impression of them.
Yeah, it's actually interesting you bring it up, back in 2010, because actually the very first new truck I ever bought was a 2010 6.4. I still have it actually now. So it was a 2010 F350, but it's a pretty rare one because it's a Harley Davidson edition, but it's the long box, which, I've maybe seen 2 or 3 others out there. Occasionally see it a 2008, but I've never seen another one of the 2010 ones that I think it came in forget what type of black they called it, but it's kind of like a gold flake with the flames and stuff on the doors and everything. But yeah, when I was looking at a 2010 truck, they had the highest GVW. And I was really looking because I was actually starting DFC in 2010, so I wanted to buy a new truck so it'd be reliable and stuff. And at the time, it was like 6.4s were like everyone's putting a 250, 300 horse tune in them. They seem to be living.
Yeah.
The transmissions were holding up because you look at a Duramax or Cummins from those years, and you're doing a transmission and a turbo, and to get that 500 plus 600 horse, you got spending like 20, 30,000 bucks on them. And, pretty much a tuner intake and exhaust, you could do it on the 6.4. So yeah, it's kind of interesting times back then. And, and we started building them around about 2013 or 14. And, when we first built them, probably the first, 1 or 200 we built were just like, wow, like this is just an awesome engine to build. They're pretty simple. And, and there wasn't really anything worn out on them too bad. At the time, the heads weren't, all cracked, and, front covers were good. And there wasn't really a lot that went into them. The biggest challenge was there wasn't a lot of aftermarket parts available. So you're buying a lot from the dealer. and then kind of to your point is as time went on and they started to age, they kind of went through this bit of an evolution in the sense that they're a really, really tough engine that put out a lot of power, but they're probably one of the least forgiving engines to lack of maintenance. Um, and that's and that's everything. That's changing your air filter, changing the oil and also your fuel filters and stuff. And so they're really developed where, it seems like guys would buy them and they'd put on, 150,000 miles or so, and then all of a sudden just everything was worn out or broken and very, very costly to fix. And that engine's definitely one that's kept us on our toes a lot over the years because it's a constantly evolving challenge, um, just in the amount of parts that you have to put into them to rebuild them properly and stuff. And that's kind of where it comes down to be where, like we've talked about before, we're always trying to offer the most value in our builds. And part of that is like, when someone comes to us, we're going to give you an engine back that, you kind of get everything that's going to be worn out that you need. We're not trying to like, hey, we'll sell you this engine, and then when you go to install it, you're going to have to buy another couple $1,000s in parts. So, yeah, as we get into it, however, it'll be interesting to talk about almost every single component of that engine and why it takes so much rework or why it's such a challenging engine to remanufacture.
With the engine itself, would you say it's because of a as far as an OEM engine, and then what you saw over the years with maintenance? Is it because it's a bad design, or is it because it was just this transitional period from emission standards changed? I mean, I don't know if the LMM had really a lot of issues. It seemed, from my perspective, that it didn't have it like the 6.7 Cummins did, with some of the emissions components, and things like that. But the 6.4, was it just trying to, I guess, meet these emission standards, and the market wasn't ready for it? Was it a bad design, combination of both? What would you say is kind of inherently flawed with it?
It, it's really a combination of everything. Like, I mean, again, like my take on some of the things is like, I mean, they were I think one of the first trucks to really come out with um or no, I guess I take that back because I guess it was like '07 and a half, '08. Both the Duramax and the Ford were coming out with them, but not sure how many remember back. But right when they first came out, they like I remember up here in Alberta, Canada, they were actually banned from going to a lot of the refineries and stuff because sometimes they're getting a fireball at the exhaust from the regens and everything. So they had a lot of those things to work out, and really that was kind of like new technology, and I don't think it fully worked out the kinks and stuff yet. Um, and then, there are definitely some design challenges. And then I would say the general quality of the parts is probably, I'd say, a little bit on the below average side. Like, I mean, most things were built strong enough, but they maybe weren't out of the best material. Like, I mean, the front covers, they're just a cast aluminum, but it's not even the best quality of cast, so they're prone for like, a lot of erosion and stuff in the water pump area from cavitation and stuff. But oddly enough, like I mean, on the front cover, for example, I mean, if like I probably like I maintenance my vehicles like, probably a lot more than even the dealer recommends. And one thing I found on the 6.4s is like, if you put a brand new front cover on, and especially like when the engine was like brand new and it got rebuilt and you never changed the coolant, then that cover is going to be really, really cavitated. But if you had changed the coolant after like 50,000 miles and kept the coolant clean and everything, usually everyone I've ever seen was actually like brand new still. Then when you move on to the block and stuff, I mean, the block, I'd say out of the Dodge, Ford, and Chevy engines, I mean, the 6 liter 6.4s are definitely like the softest casting of material. And then they have fairly thin top rings comparison to like the Cummins of the Duramax, and so they're a lot more susceptible to dusting. So it's kind of like, you know, you almost never see a Duramax engine dusted because of the induction hardening in the cylinders and the really, really thick stainless top ring. But on the 6 liter and 6.4s, I mean, if you have like an airbox or anything's bypassing at all, there it doesn't take very much to dust that engine in a hurry, but On the flip side is the programming in it's pretty advanced, and so it can compensate for some pretty worn cylinders and still run really good. Um, then you get into the cylinder heads where, very similar design to the 6 liters, but they use induction hardening where the valves go. And, again, just from, every like cast iron cracks to relieve stress. And so when you have like rapid expansion contraction all the time, you get cracking in the seat area. And I mean, fundamentally, it doesn't really cause any problems in terms of the engine. Like you'll get a bit more crankcase pressure and stuff, but the engine still runs fine. It's not like, it's gonna fail from having cracking in behind the seat area, but then it requires you to pretty much cut out that whole area and install a hardened seat afterwards. And then the heads are prone for warping a fair bit, and then like the ring gaps and stuff, like a lot of times you'll buy an engine where, like the gaps in the rings actually allow a lot more fuel to get inside the oil, and then the type of oil is designed to emulsify it, flushes out the oil change, and it helps with emissions. But it's not necessarily great for the longevity of the engine because really you want to keep as much fuel out of the engine as possible and out of the engine oil. So, um, so like the thing is like because they had like really large ring gaps, like a lot of the engines you'd pull apart, or even if you went to rebuild them, the factory rings and the rings you get aftermarket, a lot of times the second ring sometimes is at 60 70 thou ring end gap, which is like, almost looks like you'd fit a popsicle stick in between the end gap. So that's why a lot of them had like really, really heavy crankcase pressure and stuff. And um, overall, the cranks were pretty tough. Like we don't see many issues with them. But again, as we get into it, it's like one of those engines that, as it aged, um, like like a lot of the Cummins and stuff we rebuild, even as they get older, there's not too many problems with things like the blocks, and we'll slowly start seeing some problems with the heads. But the 6.4s are really one where as they aged and stuff, you just started seeing a lot of really unique problems that you don't normally see in a lot of other builds. Like, and for us, like, I mean, I've always tried sharing as much data as I could with the, other engine builders and the industry and stuff, and still figure that, we probably identified a lot of the problems with that engine many years ahead of even other people even rebuilding the things. Like one such example was, I believe it was probably around 2014 or 15. We had like a couple of engines where just out of the blue, all of a sudden they were filling the crankcase full of coolant, and we're scratching our heads at first a little bit because we couldn't find where it was coming from, um, and I shouldn't say a couple. I think it was like one particular engine, and it's like we couldn't figure out where it was coming from, and then all of a sudden, I think it was like the next month because we were building lots of them at the time, like probably building 30 or 40 of them a month at the time. And all of a sudden in one month I had 4 engines within like 1,000 kilometers. They all failed where they wiped out the main line, and they're all full of like a coolant sludge paste and stuff. And what we had actually found was the threads in the block, like the 3 bolts that are closest to the engine, to the value of the engine on either side, they can actually crack on the threads, and then you'll actually leak coolant right up the head stud or the head bolt, and then it gets into the oil pan. So that actually led us to where around 2014 or 15, we actually, when we get a core return back, we'll actually take the heads off, and we have some plates we bolt on that have some bolts that are drilled out through the center. And we do a pressure test on it when it comes back just to, try and qualify it as a good core. But then when we actually finish building the engine, we put the heads on, and we'll actually put a couple of plates on to block everything off. And we pressure test them for about 20 minutes after assembly. And about 1% of them have it where, they'll fail and they'll start leaking air, and they're actually leaking where they'd be leaking coolant up. And then we got to take the whole engine apart and throw the block out. So it's one where you just finished going through all the machining process and then, building the entire engine to find out it's no good. Now you got to throw it out.
Wow. Wow. It's when you were mentioning some of the components and how they fail, it almost converges to this one point where I wonder, or I used to ask, is it because of the emission systems components that are on the engine, they're just kind of beating the engine up over time and then it fails, or was it an issue of the materials? So what, in this discussion, what I'm gathering is it's actually the materials, the castings, the parts that are in the engine, whether it had emissions on or was in some other part of the world where they don't have to have that, you would still run into these same sort of issues.
Yeah, like the thing is like I mean obviously like a lot of the design of it and stuff, I mean it does it's hard on all diesel engines. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, like, there's been never ending discussions about it, but fundamentally, like, all the emissions related components is there solely for emissions, but it doesn't necessarily, from an engine manufacturer standpoint, it really doesn't help the longevity of the engine for sure. I mean, it does like, plug things up, your EGR gets plugged, it's inhaling obviously like dirty exhaust gases back through the intake. A lot of the cycles of them result in getting a lot more fuel in the crankcase, which, if you don't do oil changes as frequently, can lead to like, prematurely worn out valve train as well as like engine bearings and stuff. And then just when you combine that, all those type of things that obviously all the diesel engines go through in the challenges, but you have it with like softer materials and materials are more susceptible to wear. That's where they just like, again, it goes back to be, it's like if you don't really, really service that engine a lot, it prematurely wears out. Like, like for example, um, like the 6 liter and 6.4 engines, I mean, like what technically was lubricating the rocker arms is like the oil that travels up through the lifter, through the push rod, through the rocker arm. But the reason why 6 liter rocker arms never wore out all the time was because you also had that Huey oil rail system and it hemorrhaged oil everywhere. So you weren't just getting oil up the push rod, you're also getting oil that's hemorrhaging out of the oil rail all over the place and it's keeping the top end well lubricated. On a 6.4, because it has more limited lubrication, if you start running a low quality oil or like too thick of an oil for the ambient temperature, then you'll get it where you're not getting enough lubrication in the top end on a cold start, and then it creates starts creating some wear. And because the design of like the pivot points and the rocker arms, those pivot points will actually wear into some grooves, and then it actually completely shuts off oil to supply to some of the parts, and then they really aggressively start wearing. So it's kind of like, is it that's where you could say it's like, well, is it a bad design or is it a maintenance thing? Like from my experience, though, is like, because again, I've like I owned one of these trucks from new and I had over 100,000 miles on it. And even my mechanic at the time was shocked because when we went to do one of my built engines to put into it, like the engine was still running great because I'd bought another shop truck that I wanted to put the engine out of my black Harley into the F550. And so we built an engine for mine. But when we pulled it apart with over 100,000 miles, like all my rocker arms were literally like brand new, like not a single one was worn out. But I've put brand new rocker assemblies on engines that we've rebuilt, and in 20,000 miles they're worn out. And so it's like it's more of the type of oil and then the grade of oil that they're using that leads to that. So if you are running and again on my service intervals though, like I mean I would when I wasn't towing a trailer and I was just daily driving the truck, I would, let's say, drive probably the equivalent of about 6 or 7,000 miles on an oil change. But every second oil change, I would drop the oil, put in just a bunch of cheap oil, drive around for 20 minutes, then drop that oil, then put my synthetic back in it. So it would really flush out anything that was building up over time. To people that are putting on higher mileage and everything, um, and doing extended oil changes, well, again, when it was new it was fine and there wasn't a problem. As you start getting up there in 100 200,000 miles, that's just where all that excess sludge and stuff starts building up and it starts causing more problems down the road.
Yeah, it's so tough. We've talked about it on other podcasts as well. Is it maintenance? Is it design? Is it age? On one of our other conversations, you had mentioned the difficulty in finding good cores and
Mhm.
things that are buildable. And I think like one of the really common questions that I'll see is somebody will find a used 6.4 and it might have 90,000 miles, 80,000, 120.
Mhm.
And the question is it a good buy? I know that's impossible to answer without going through, the whole truck. But if somebody, like, can you make these reliable with a built engine, can it be something that lasts 200, 300, 400,000 miles? Are there aftermarket parts and support and things you guys have learned over the years to be able to address some of these issues that these engines have?
Oh, absolutely. Like, I mean, that's the thing is, I mean, the one nice thing about, let's say, rebuilding the factory core is like, yeah, there is some, core shift and they do kind of warp and distort a little bit. But in general, I mean, it settles a bit. And then, when you remachine it, it's usually pretty good. I mean, it doesn't kind of keep on warping and distorting. So it's kind of like, because there's some castings that are like, they're, right from the time they use them, they stay in the exact same place. Like nothing really moves around. Again, like a 6.4 is like on the block again is because they have that same one piece bed plate design for the main cap, just like a 6 liter. But almost every one of them, like, again, around 2015, we realized that it's like, why is it that, you take a perfectly good running engine apart and just unbolting the main cap, if you bolt it back together, now the main's too tight. And it's just because it kind of like it, from heating and cooling, it had created a bit of a spring to it, but it didn't move until you like let off the clamp load of the bolts. So that means that's like, well, every single block you do, you have to actually, so we have to like mainline every single 6.4 without question, because every single one you pretty much pull apart. If it's never been mainlined before, it's almost always too tight on the main line. And then, the next thing is we have to grind usually at least the mains on almost every crank, because probably 90+% cranks that we pull out, again, the engine is running fine, the bearings weren't failed or anything, but then you pull it out and you put it in a set of V blocks and it has 3 thou run out. So, we both number 1 and 5 main are turning perfectly true, but the main bearing in the middle is actually deflecting like 3 thou for the journal. So, we grind that, straighten everything out and everything. So that's like saying that every block. So now we have to bore every block oversized. We have to surface every block. We have to mainline every block. We have to grind almost every single crank, almost every single front cover. We've been, because of how expensive the aftermarket was, for years, we've been, welding them up and then remachining them in our 5-axis CNC. And we've actually found that if anything, the weld that we're putting in is of better quality than the factory casting was. So we've never seen one that after the facts, like, had any more cavitation later. And we've never had one come apart. So it's been, again, it's, when you buy another engine, it doesn't come with a front cover. It's kind of like not adding value to the customer, because they're going to need it, because almost every cover is cavitated. It has scratching in the oil pump area and stuff. And then on the cylinder heads, I mean, we currently have like our engines priced like about where like the fallout of the cylinder heads is like 50+% on ones we can't reuse. So it's like saying that, one out of every two cylinder heads that goes on an engine is a brand new casting. And even when we buy brand new castings, we treat every single one like a core. So we take, if there's seats in it, we take the seats out so we can put our seats in it, because we want them with higher crush so they never fall out. We cordial ream them out. We put in our guides to it, our valves, everything else. And then when you get to the top end of the engine, probably 80+% are always worn out, the rocker arms. So virtually everyone's getting like new rocker arms, new push rods. But then even another one that you have to be careful of is even the valve bridges. So when you look at the valve bridges, there's always like one round hole and one oval hole on the underside of it. And it's because like as the valve train's cycling, the oval hole is allowing it, because it's not like it goes straight down. It has to slide a bit. So it keeps it from kind of pushing or pulling on the ends of the valves and breaking them. But what's interesting is, again, going back to that lack of lubrication from proper grade of oil and stuff, is they'll develop a little bit of a groove in that oval part of the valve bridge. And then what happens is if you assemble a new head with new valves and you reuse that valve bridge, you'll get it where at higher RPM, the valve will grab the ridge in that valve bridge, and it'll hold, because they're hydraulic lifters, it'll hold that valve, just one out of two of the valves, down a little bit more, and you'll smack the top of the piston and leave a valve impression in it.
Wow.
So it's like, so now we're at the point where to rebuild every single 6.4, it's kind of like we have to, again, bore the block, surface the block, mainline the block, pressure test the block. We have to, um, if it's the factory heads, we have to cut out the factory induction hardening, install seats. Then we have to pressure test after we install seats because there's like up to a quarter inch, like 250 thou core shift in them. So after you cut the seat pocket out, it's like, well, do I still have 200 thou material or do I have 30 thou material behind it? Because if you don't pressure test them after you install seats, you can have it where it leaks coolant into the cylinder or you'll get white smoke and stuff on startup. You got to pressure test and check to make sure the injector cup's not leaking or the glow plug cup's not leaking. We O-ring every single 6.4 head to prevent premature head gasket failure because oddly enough, they're actually kind of strange in that I think I talked about this on another one, but sorry, I'll come back to this. I'll finish through. But anyway, so yeah, every head, so we O-ring them, and then on the valve train, we have to do new rockers, new push rods, new valve bridges in the vast majority of them. And then the front cover, we have to, weld up, we have to remachine everything else. Most get new front oil pumps and stuff. And then after that, it's like, your whole set of brand new pistons, bearings, gaskets, you name it. I mean, that's about the only way you can properly rebuild a 6.4. But just finish off with the head studs. But that was the interesting thing that I think I talked about before is, when the 6.4 first came out, we're thinking it's like, oh, well, if we had good success with the ARP head studs or whatever, because of the 4 bolts per cylinders, we should use them in 6.4s. And then we saw over time where it's like, 1 in 10 6.4s with head studs would actually have it where we had a premature head gasket failure. And usually it was almost like clockwork. It was almost always within like the 10 to 15,000 miles. And then, but we were seeing about 1 in 50 fail with stock head bolts. But the ones that failed with the stock head bolts always had it where they would be blown out like all cylinders, both banks and everything. So it was more of a tuning issue at that point. But the reason why the head studs were actually leaking is because, and why, if you're ever going to put head studs in a 6.4, you have to ring the heads, is that same issue why they crack on the threads of the head bolt holes is the the actual contour of the block threads will contour to the threads of the head stud. So even though you torque them all to like 300 foot-pounds with that heating and cooling cycling in the first 10,000 miles or so, you'll actually get like one random bolt a lot of times that the coarse end of the thread will contour to the threads of the stud more, and you lose about 50 foot-pounds of torque on the stud. So essentially what'll happen is like you'll have it where all the other bolts are at 300 foot-pounds, you have one that drops to 250, and then that's where your head gasket blows. And what's interesting is like if you were to dismantle it and bolt it back together, because it's already contoured to that stud, it won't ever fail again. You'll likely go another 200,000 miles and never have an issue.
Wow. I'm seeing how complex these are to build. I mean, I'm sure all engines are complex to build, but just all the different steps you have to go through to ensure that everything's going to work properly. It seems more intensive
Yeah.
than maybe some other engine platforms.
No, for sure. I mean, it's kind of like there's more steps involved to it, and then that's kind of where like when you start getting an engine that has this many steps involved and this many components going in, I mean, again, like it's going back to that value thing. Like for us, like we're having to look at it saying it's like, look, I mean, we're building these engines, we're standing behind them for the 5 year 100,000 miles sort of thing. So we have to be very particular about, well, what processes are we doing, what QC steps, because we got to stand behind that thing for a long time. I mean, there's lots of other manufacturers out there that likely have really good track records saying it's like, oh, we build them all the time and we don't have any issues. But if you sell it, let's say as a short block where it doesn't come with a front cover, it doesn't come with heads, it doesn't come with, all the valve train and everything, there's a lot less liability or things that you could ever say actually went wrong with your build. And so you could say, yeah, I have really good success. But the challenging thing is like when you're building it to the level of replacing all the components the customer is going to need, it's a lot more complicated. There's a lot more steps involved to be successful with it.
Well, I was thinking of the aftermarket and maybe some of the parts that are available. Have there been any advancements over the years, like say with pistons or rings or just other components that have really helped make this engine last? Like one of the early problems I remember hearing about was, I think it was cylinder 8 cracking, and I think at that time people were talking about it being related to an injection event with emissions and regen and things like that. And so I was curious if the aftermarket has caught up or made it easier or better for you as an engine builder to assemble one of these and have it last.
Um, there's definitely some parts and stuff that make the engines better that, we employ with a bunch of our builds. Like again, I think there's a lot of different perspectives. And I mean, again, like I could very well be missing some too. I mean, it's always interesting when you build engines in Canada and the States, like we'll see types of failures that are a little bit different up here than let's say what you see in very, very warm climates or vice versa. So I think anywhere someone's building a decent amount of these may see some unique things. I mean, one thing that I always noticed, let's say in the first 4 or 5 years of 6.4s were out, is a lot of times you'd see it where, and I think it's actually cylinder two. It's the front cylinder on the driver's side. That a lot of times, if you're going to see a cylinder fail, such as like let's say melt or scrub the cylinder from overfueling, it was almost always that one. But when you kind of actually looked at the fuel system, it was kind of unique, and I kind of like analogize it like kind of like a river and sediment. So it's kind of like, as you have twists and turns and stuff, there's areas where stuff will flow in easily, but there's other areas that you kind of get stuck in like a little whirlpool. And based on how the fuel system was, it seemed like if there was ever any leftover crap that might be in the fuel system, it just always seemed to go through cylinder two first. Um, so a lot of the challenges that people actually experience in 6.4s is a lot of times not even caused by the base engine itself. A lot of times it can be caused by the components that go on it or even who installed it. Like in 2014, I think that we repaired over, it was a pretty big number. It was like 35 or 36 engines that installers screwed up on install. And the most common one was no one really took the torque sequence seriously on the injector lines. So I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, but it was something like 58 or 9 inch-pounds. But then you do a 60-degree turn, which is like one flat. So it's kind of like a torque turn method, kind of similar to like a head bolt. And a lot of shops, they just kind of, oh, I'm just going to snug them or I'm going to reuse them. And then what happens is you get a high pressure fuel leak inside the crankcase. So then what leads to that is so you start getting fuel that's going in the crankcase. And when you get it's about 3 or 4 quarts, it's diluted the oil enough that because of the closed crankcase system, so you have it um where your oil fill is, there's a hose off the side of it that goes into the air intake to the turbos. And what it does is it's always creating like a negative pressure on it. So it's kind of inhaling a lot of the oil vapor back through the whole intake system. And that's kind of why they tend to sweat a bit of oil at all the intercooler joints. So when you dilute the oil, again with about 3 or 4 quarts of oil, now you start getting that oily oil slash diesel mix that's getting ingested into the engine. But because of the design of 6.4s, the lowest point of the intercooler, which is also the pipe that um so like one of the pipes that goes to the lowest point of the intercooler, what'll happen is it'll start filling with a little bit of oil and fuel. So if you think like how like if you're I think a lot of people, I think almost every mechanic's done it at some point where they have the air box or air filter off and they start sliding their hand over the intake of the air box, and all of a sudden if you go to plug off most of it, it wants to suck your hand in all of a sudden. Because it's kind of like you're creating more suction the more you block off. So as you get that oil and fuel build up in the bottom of the intercooler, eventually you'll get to the point where it'll just all of a sudden create a massive suction. So when you hit like, let's say 20, 25 pounds boost, it'll just all of a sudden put all that oil and fuel through the engine. And it's like, it's crazy how you could see 100 failures and they all almost look identical is because the design of the cylinders and the horseshoe intake pattern is when that oil and fuel gets sucked in, most of it hits cylinder two right away, but then some will hit cylinder one because they're right at the front of the engine on the U shape. And then you start getting some deposits in cylinders four and six and three and five, but then whatever's left has to go into cylinders seven and eight. So what you end up doing is it's usually you bend 5 out of 8 connecting rods, and usually cylinder two is the worst, where it'll actually bend it to where the piston will make contact with the counterweight of the crankshaft, and it'll start knocking bad, and it'll start binding on the journal of the crankshaft via the rod. And in that process, it also melts most of the pistons. And a lot of people, I think, sometimes think, oh, well, that takes a long period of time, or it can't just happen that quickly. I would say that if, and so going back to like us fixing like 35 or 36 of these engines, is what always happens is you see people where they lift the cab in the air. When they lift the cab in the air, they leave that one intercooler pipe that goes to the lowest point on the intercooler. And people weren't thinking, gee, I should take that off and drain it or inspect it. So what would happen is they'd lift the cab up in the air, put the engine in, drop the cab down, and literally like they'd start it up, running great and everything. They'd pull out of the yard, and the second they step on the gas and they get to maybe 20 pounds boost like that, it just, you know, put a bunch of oil and fuel through the engine. You've now bent 5 rods and melted a good chunk of the pistons. And it
Wow.
literally happens in seconds.
Wow. That'd be pretty scary.
And it's usually a thing where it's like it'll rev up, like it'll rev up a little bit for a second, let out a big cloud of white smoke, and then in those a person will say, "Oh, now it's knocking a bit." And so what we started doing is I think I've talked about before is we started making these like low adhesive stickers that go all over the engine. So we have like these blue stickers that on the intake runner, for example, it says clean inspect intercooler before starting engine. Because we had that in our install instructions, but I'm not going to say I'm not guilty of it too. Like, everyone buys something from IKEA and then never reads the instructions on it. They try and put it together first and then have to go back later. So we found by having something someone has to physically remove, it helps make that mechanic be more successful installing the engine. Because even though like none of those failures were our fault, it still sucks because then you get these shops where like, well, I can't afford to buy the customer another engine. What can you do to help me out? And it still creates a tough situation overall because like we want to help them out, but it's like, we can't just take losses on engines because, someone else not installing something correctly, right?
Right. Right. Is it, as far as, in 2024, is there still a good number of these trucks, a good number of demand for these types of engines? Because I have no clue, how many are still on the road, how many people are still getting. I kind of see from comments and discussions, like I mentioned in the beginning, people were asking, to hear about 6.4. So they're kind of in my mind, I think people are still picking these trucks up, in the used market. They don't maybe know the history of it. They're probably not like your truck where you were kind of over maintenancing it and staying ahead
Yeah.
of everything. So is it still a big demand, for these engines?
I mean, it's slowed down a bit, but I mean, there's still a very, very steady sale for us. I mean, again, I know they were only built for a very short window of time, but they sold a lot of trucks in those 3 years. And that was also the first year that they came out with like the F450s, which was a huge selling truck. And so, and you still also had the kind of like the special editions, like the Harley Davidsons and the King Ranches and stuff. And just like I still own my 6.4, I mean, for the guys that have taken good care of them or whatever else, I mean, it's like they're still happy to put an engine in it because they love the truck. And I mean, my black Harley, I mean, um, like because we had it in because we're also putting one of the speed of air engines in it to do some testing and stuff too. But the baseline of the engine build I have in it now, so I mean, it's got an older Spartan tuner on it, on the 210 tow performance setting, and with like the turbos and injectors and all the other mods I have done to it. At the rear hub, so not the wheels, but like it's a hub dyno. It did 668 horse and I think like 1170 or something foot-pounds of torque. And with that platform, think I'm still on my bone stock transmission that I just put a billet input and a upgraded torque converter on, and I have 110,000 miles on it, and I've towed 20,000 pound toy hauler fifth wheels where you're still either pretty much accelerating or maintaining speed up any hill and making that type of power, and the thing makes like 60 pounds of boost, and again, never feels like it powers out anywhere. And I mean, I don't drive the truck very much. I mean, it probably has 20, 30,000 miles on the build since I put it in there. But there's a thing where it's like, the the stock rear diff and then the transmission and then obviously a built engine, but they put down really good power. And I mean, it's been, obviously really reliable at that. So,
Yeah, it's always been it was one of the few trucks where it was just so much power you could have or you could get with them, and with very little investment really. And it was like you had sequential turbos, you had plenty of fuel delivery, the transmission held up really well. It was almost like the ultimate kind of hot rod diesel truck
mhm.
back in its time. And when I've done some episodes with enthusiasts, people who race them, and they're really passionate about that truck. They love it.
Mhm.
And I guess this next question that I have for you, it might be kind of tough. If you were to step back and say you didn't found and own DFC Diesel, you didn't build engines, and you were looking at one, would you shy away from buying one? Or would there be some things you would want to check out or want to know before you purchase one? I'm thinking about the guy who maybe sees one on a marketplace somewhere. It's got the mileage he wants. He's looking for that particular truck because he always loved it. What
Mhm.
would you suggest that somebody do, say before buying one, to make sure, if they can, to make sure it's maybe doesn't need an engine right away. Maybe it's a good purchase.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, like, I mean, if, because, like a lot of people that buy these type of trucks, like we're all enthusiasts at different levels and stuff typically. And so it really depends on someone's knowledge base on it. And I mean, I'm assuming going in fairly blind on it, like, they like the truck and they're just kind of wondering on it. Like
Yeah,
my recommendation would be is like, you do still want to, like obviously like they'd be learning on a podcast like this, one of the things to the challenges on rebuilding an engine. But I mean, you'd want to have a good relationship with, wherever they're from. Like they obviously have the mechanic shop to deal with and like, are they ask them questions on and get good feedback and stuff, things that they can potentially watch for on the build. But I think fundamentally the thing that always keep in the back of the mind is even a very well maintained, not just a 6.4, but any truck. I mean, it could need an engine at any point in time, or it could need something like that. So I think it's more important that if someone want it, if it's truly the truck you want to keep it for a long period of time, is really cost out, like saying it's like, well, at some point one day I'm going to need an engine, and to rebuild it properly, what am I looking at? And then if that number, for the engine, and then let's say doing new injectors and high pressure pump and turbos and everything else, I mean, that's where you can start getting into 30, $40,000 in a pretty quick hurry with an install. And if they're aware of that one day that could be coming, and there's, but then know that it's like, hey, at that point it should be a built truck. They'll have it for the lifetime the truck's gonna last and stuff. Um, that they'd just be prepared for that. Because I mean, again, too, like the thing with the 6.4 is it's weird because like I had lots of guys that, they put them on like the HD 300 tunes, whatever, and they lasted years and never cracked a piston. And then, you get into like these newer ones and it's like, how is it? The guys are like, oh, I barely have like a toe tune on it, cracked a piston. But so it's kind of like, it's I don't necessarily know why it's like, some of the stock pistons held up so much better than the other ones. And I mean, in the aftermarket, you have a couple of choices. You can upgrade to the Max Force 7 pistons, which kind of it just has a larger bowl and a softer radius. But the factory chamfered piston excuse me, will still take like kind of a lot more abuse than the Max Force 7 one will. Um, we've been using UEM pistons actually for about 6 years now, and the data is pretty conclusive. I mean, when it comes to just for the sheer volume of engines we do, and then the amount that you might potentially see back with a cracked piston or a hole in piston, and we've had just significantly better success with the UEM pistons. They just seem to be a way more durable piston than a lot of what else is available in the aftermarket. So that's actually been one great thing about for building the engines is that that's actually helped our engines hold up a lot better. Um, then it's another thing that I think someone should ask themselves when they're looking at buying one of these trucks is like, what are they planning on using it for? Um, Something that just popped into my head to actually point out, and this kind of goes back to the service thing that I don't think a lot of people talk about is when you buy let's say if you buy a 6.4 and it's a like a 1 ton single wheel, I think they usually come with like 354 gearing, 355 in the rear diff. But if you buy like an F450 or an F550, it comes with like 430 or 488s. And so when we're talking about servicing and stuff, people have to remember is like if you buy a truck that has 354 gearing and you put on 3,000 miles, and then you buy this F550, it has 488 gears and you put on 3,000 miles, um, that 488 gear truck has turned over hundreds of thousands of times more than the 355 truck has. And so you have to factor that into your maintenance and servicing. So even when guys like that's kind of why we try and identify like what application is this going in because if someone puts in a 450 or 550 right away the servicing intervals have to increase just because that engine's rotating over a lot more because it's going down the highway at a higher RPM all the time.
That's a really good point. That's it's such a I know it can be really tough. Like I'm never able to answer the question when somebody asks, like, "Hey, take a look at this marketplace ad. Is this a good buy?" Like I'm definitely, not qualified to be able to answer that. And I think the point you made about planning, like if something bad happens, it doesn't have to be the engine; it can be the transmission, and it can apply to
Yeah.
any truck. It's just saying, is this worth it versus going and buying a new truck? And a lot of times, it can be. It is
Mhm.
worth getting that older truck and investing into it and making it better. I think something you mentioned earlier, I did want to ask you. It may or may not apply directly to 6.4s. But because you guys build engines all over North America, totally different climates, are there certain common sort of failures you see in colder climates or warmer, or something that if somebody lives in an area that has extreme temperature variation, they should think about as it pertains to maintenance, on their trucks?
Uh, yeah, well, I mean, like the first easiest one is, I mean, like that's where the grade of the oil is like so important all the time. Because I mean, again, like it's kind of challenging because I mean, it's like, you read, let's say the you'll sometimes read like let's say like the Dodge, the Ford, or the Chevy owner's manual and stuff, and you'll see some of the oils that they recommend for different applications. But people also have to remember that that's also recommending an oil for an application on a completely bone stock truck. The type of oil, the grade, and the quality as you increase power has to change as well. So it's like, you want to use a good quality oil that's, going to be able to take the loads placed upon it. Like, because sometimes I'll see where a guy runs like a 10W30 oil and they're like, oh, well, this is what the dealer recommends to run. But then it's like, okay, but you're making 200 horse over stock and now you're towing in a very hot climate. And then they wonder how they can like, get ridiculously hot oil temps. And then when the oil gets that thin, then you start making contact with the bearings and it leads to hot shorts and everything else. So, um, the first and foremost would definitely be like, the proper grade of oil. And then it's kind of using a bit of common sense too. I mean, um, in very, very cold climates, even if you are using a very thin oil, it still definitely helps, obviously, plugging the truck in, or even better, putting an oil pan heater on. Um, and then, and it's like anything. It doesn't really matter whether it's extremely hot or extremely cold. When you're talking about extremes one way or the other, service intervals have to increase, period. So I mean, then it's just like, so you go from the grade of the oil and stuff, then how often am I servicing it? Um, and then, and sometimes, like, again, clearances can play a big thing too. I mean, obviously you can get away with a little bit tighter bearing clearances in hot climates than you can in cold climates. Um, just because, I mean, because sometimes like even though if you're like the new 6.7 Ford for example is like this is I mean I think that they recommend in some applications that thing can come with like 10W30 oil, but if you have if you're making again the stock power level and you have very very tight bearing clearances, that thinner grade of oil can still maintain the oil wedge needed to support the load on it. But again, you add power to it. Now it can penetrate that wedge because you don't have like the oil just isn't thick enough. That's why like when you get into like and again, like I'm not, I don't know the exact weight of it, but obviously, like when you get into like the top fuel dragsters and everything else, whatever. I mean, they're running like a straight like 50 weight oil or whatever it is. Like, again, like the higher the load, the thicker the oil that have to go in. But then it's like, you know, it's always challenging up here in Canada because you'll get the guys where it's like, well, I want to make 1,000 horse, I want to drive it year round, and I want to be able to tow my trailer whenever. So it's like, you need to build an engine for that. It's like, hey, well, there's there's a lot more variables to take in here.
It's always fascinating to go through these kind of year ranges of trucks and understand the challenges that each one can provide. I think as like a diesel enthusiast, even though I've never owned a 6.4, it's something I'm curious about. I want to know more. And listeners that are out there looking for one of these trucks, or maybe it's been sitting in the garage for a while and needs an engine, and they're just looking for information and asking themselves that question: Can I have a reliable engine? Can I have something
Yeah.
that I can put hundreds of thousands of miles on? So I appreciate you going through that year range with us. I know the people who requested information on it, are definitely going to appreciate that. Before we as we're heading into 2025, I wanted to ask you for our conversation ends. Are there some things you're really looking forward to, and kind of in the first part, maybe the first quarter of next year, that we should pay attention to that you guys are working on? Anything like that we should pay attention to and look for some news from DFC Diesel.
So I mean, it's still a little bit premature, but it was an exciting thing or whatever. So we did actually get um more of them are obviously coming right behind this, but we do actually have SEMA Garage certification on all of our 6.6 LML engines. So I mean, those all passed, and I mean, did exactly what we said they would and everything else. And we just have to do a little bit more testing, and then we should have it where, again, in the first quarter of next year, we're hoping to see it where we have actually a physical SEMA certification on all of our engine platforms. We also, in the last month, released our L5P Duramaxes. So we're now offering short blocks, long blocks, street series, everything else in those ones. That was an engine that we were starting to get requested a lot more. And um, we are working on the 19 and up Cummins, but in the meantime, we actually offer a hybrid where we do the 2018 and older 6.7 Cummins conversion. So we offer a platform that utilizes the 2019 and up front gear case, camshaft, and or just front gear train and stuff. So that way you can actually bolt the old 2018 older engine directly into the 2019 and up, and then you get away from like the hydraulic lifter failures and things like that. The engine bolts straight in. I think the only thing that it is a little bit different is the one of the four ECM bolts don't line up on the block, but everyone that's doing that conversion has been happy just to have an option that's not going to have a camshaft failure again.
Those are gonna be some cool topics to go over. I've seen some people asking about L5P stuff, and then the 2019 plus 6.7 Cummins option. So we'll definitely have to visit those here in the future. But I appreciate your time today, Matt, chatting about 6.4s, educating me, giving me some information, and really some solid choices out there that are in the aftermarket. If somebody has one of these trucks or they're looking for them, you guys have options for a built engine.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, yeah, and it was good talking about like I think when we started, I was like the 6.4 engine's definitely an engine that produces a lot of content and stuff. And I mean, I'm sure we could probably even go for another hour or so. It's kind of like, like I said, the hour goes very quickly on the subject. So
Well, it's cool chatting with you. If I don't chat with you before the end of the year, hope you guys have a great Christmas, New Year's, and yeah, you got some really cool things launching in the first quarter. So I'm sure we'll sit back down and chat about some new platforms.
yeah, you as well. Thanks, Patrick.
Don't forget, Diesel fans, make sure and head on over to kershaw.kaiusa.com. Use code 40 TDP 2024 for up to 40% off MSRP. It's a great way to save some money and get some cool gear. If you're in the market for a new knife for EDC, hunting, fishing, around the job site, around the house, they've got you covered with a bunch of different options for blade steel, blade shape, handle design, different opening mechanisms, and their whole lineup's designed to meet any budget that you might have. So we appreciate them offering that discount code just for Diesel Podcast listeners. Also want to give a shout out to some of our Patreon supporters: Tyler Loewen, 23 Diesel, CUTTERUP Rob, Robert, all of our other Patreon supporters, all of you who subscribe on YouTube, podcast apps, follow us on social media. We appreciate all your support here in year 8 of the Diesel Podcast and look forward to bringing you more of the content that you want to hear in 2024. Till next time, keep the shiny side up.